I knew that he was sick. I knew that this was tied to grief, and I knew that this was tied to his mental health. I knew who he was when he was sober. I knew that he could get back there. And I was so focused on holding on to that piece of him that I knew he was when he was sober that I was not willing to acknowledge who he was becoming as an addict. I stayed in my 16-year marriage with my abusive alcoholic husband. And I don't regret the decisions that I had to make during those years of survival, but I do want to use our story to be able to help people understand what that looks like and what that struggle is like behind those closed doors. His addiction came into play through grief. And I didn't understand addiction in the beginning of our relationship. I didn't understand how that addiction would change his personality into who he became. And the grief of losing someone incredibly close to him was really the catalyst that started his addiction. I tell that story in one of my other episodes that I'll link below. You can go listen to that and hear how losing his younger brother really sent him down the road of this addiction in our marriage. And, I left him during that time. It was a very hard decision for me to do because I knew that he was hurting, but, I can have compassion for his grief and still understand that I needed to have a safe space for me and our children. We had 2 young children, and his behavior was devastating and destructive. I thought the grief would eventually fade and sobriety would finally start. And we would find ourselves in, this place where we are, we're just killing it as a couple and growing and evolving. And I didn't really understand how the cycle of sobriety would come into play and how those cycles of sobriety would work to keep me stuck in the marriage until the very end, where it became almost impossible for me to leave. And so if you're currently navigating a marriage that's narcissistically or psychologically abusive, or you're navigating marriage with an addiction and, don't know really what that looks like, or just are looking for some insight, then this is for you. I really hope that our story can be used to help other people navigating their situations. And if this resonates with you, I would love for you to subscribe, like, and comment, and let me know your stories and share it with someone who this may help. If you're new here, my name's Elizabeth. This is From Hell to Healed. And, this is really the story of how I got caught in a 16-year marriage with a incredibly malignant, narcissistically abusive addict. The cycles of sobriety that came through in our situation, that first cycle of sobriety that we hit, where I knew that he could get sober. I left him. I told him it's either me or the addiction, and he made a choice. He put himself in rehab. He got himself sober. And I honestly thought that this was going to be the change and that we would just be sober from here on out. But I didn't know what was coming down the road. And I didn't really understand how much grief would play into keeping him in that addiction. Unfortunately for my husband, he lost almost everybody in his village. By the time we were divorced, he had lost at least 5 or 6 of the closest people to him. And those losses were the catalyst that kept sort of pushing him off the wagon, if you will. Grief is something that I had never experienced. I had never lost anyone really close to me until I lost him. And he used to tell me all the time, Liz, you don't understand. You don't understand how hard this grief is. And so, we got married in 2007. And by 2015, I threatened to divorce him. In 2015, he got himself sober and went into rehab. And we had a period of sobriety where things were looking great. And then, we had another situation where he lost someone close to him. My ex-husband was adopted as a baby, and he grew up in his adopted family. But when he was 18, his birth mother found him. She had always regretted giving him up, and she had established a family and wanted to include him in it. And so we were very much connected to his blood family as well as his adopted family. And his birth mother showed up as a true mother figure. He didn't talk about his birth father much, but I knew his birth father was an addict. And, about, I would say 6 months into his sobriety, he lost his birth father. And that loss really affected him. He didn't have a relationship with his birth father, but his birth father died in a bad way. He was an addict, and it was a very, kind of bad passing. And that passing really kind of took him back down that road to addiction. With each cycle of sobriety, whenever he would start drinking again after a period of sobriety, it's like the addiction ramped up. And so in 2015, whereas, he would have a rage event maybe once every 6 months, by 2017, we are now dealing with more consistent abuse. I've got a toddler, I've got a young little girl, and I am working full time, trying to hold the house down, trying to get this man sober. We are fighting more and more. Our environment is becoming increasingly toxic. And by 2017, it's really starting to take a toll on my health. From 2015 to 2017, my medical issues started to really come into play here. I didn't know this at the time, but long-term narcissistic and psychological abuse is actually medically connected to multiple medical issues, including autoimmune disease, heart disease, stroke, neurological issues, cancer, mental health collapse, early death due to mental health collapse, CPTSD, and, a slew of other things. And I'm starting to have medical issues that really can't be explained. And going down that process of finding doctors and, getting gaslit into believing that it's just in my head when, my body is quite literally taking the toll. I now know that it's due to the high levels of cortisol of being in fight or flight. We didn't know which version of him we were going to get when he would come home. And so I'm now starting to realize that his personality is changing quite a bit when he is incredibly drunk. It's not happening all the time, but it's happening more often. And so he's coming home and he is just wasted. And, the kids want to, they want to engage with him. They haven't seen him all day. He's spending more and more time away from the family. And I'm now having to make excuses for his absence. And so, we're missing him at birthdays. We're missing him on holidays. Anytime that he could make an excuse or start a fight so that he could go to the bar, he's now doing. And we're fighting constantly now. The relationship is turning incredibly toxic, and my health is declining fast. And this, for me, is becoming like, the saxophones are getting louder and louder and louder, but I don't know how to navigate this. The only way that I know how to navigate this because of my background is, as a wife, I took those vows. I knew that he was sick. I knew that this was tied to grief, and I knew that this was tied to his mental health. I knew who he was when he was sober. I knew that he could get back there. And I was so focused on holding on to that piece of him that I knew he was when he was sober that I was not willing to acknowledge who he was becoming as an addict. And that's one of the things that gets us stuck in these long-term, incredibly abusive situations. And so for me, I'm now covering it up. right? I'm hiding our messiness by a perfectly curated Instagram. Our house is, it's a gorgeous house. We moved to a new house. We were into real estate at the time, and so we were doing what's called house hacking. We would live in our houses for about 2 to 3 years and fix them up and then sell them for a profit and move to a new location. And so this was now our third house that we had hacked. And, he loved working in the yard. We moved out to the country, and he had 2 acres that he could just work in. And, on good days, we were just doing amazing, but we were having more bad days than normal. And those bad days are getting progressively worse. And the addiction is really starting to become the forefront of our marriage. It really is the third party in our marriage. Now, we're going to church. We're doing Celebrate Recovery. We're even doing therapy. And so technically, we're doing the right things. We're addressing this addiction. We're communicating about it. We're talking about it. He is actively, responsive of wanting to make these changes. He just is unable to. And he's making those choices of not doing it. And as his wife, I felt a responsibility to save him. I took those vows seriously, for better or for worse. And for me, I'm gaslighting myself into it's not as bad as I think. Right? It's not physical abuse. He's just a dick when he's drunk. That's the alcohol talking. I started to dismiss it and gaslight myself. And this happens a lot when you're navigating this level of addiction, is because you don't want to admit where it's headed. You don't want to see the writing on the wall. You want your man back. You want him to make those choices. But I mean, you can lead a man to water. You can't force him to drink it, and you certainly can't stop him if he chooses to die of thirst. He made choices, and I now know, as I've healed and gone through pretty intensive therapy, that, it was never my responsibility to save him, but I took that responsibility. And I was going to do everything in my power to try and save him from himself, even if that meant losing myself. And I did. Now that our relationship is turning into sort of this toxic environment, my health is declining very, very quickly. My mental health is declining very, very quickly. And I've got a team of doctors that we're trying to figure out what's going on. I do have a history of autoimmune in my family. And so I just assumed that genetically this was, what my, what my cards were. And I'm just going on that journey of trying to diagnose and really figure out why my body is failing me. But during this time, I'm journaling and I'm writing down sort of, these events that are happening, and you're dealing with brain fog, chronic fatigue, chronic pain. The pain was so bad that I could barely walk. I'm losing mobility, and I am a very young, very active, athletic woman. I ran a marathon in 2009, 18 months after I had a child. I, played volleyball and ran track all through high school. I've always been very, very active and had always worked out all through our marriage and all through our situation, even as my health was declining. And no matter what I would do, I'm gaining weight. There's a really hardcore amount of pain that I'm dealing with. My mental health is tanking, and I can't seem to put the brakes on this. I can't seem to figure out what's going on with me. And it wasn't until 2018, 2019, that I was finally diagnosed with fibromyalgia and rheumatoid arthritis. And now this is important because RA and fibro, as well as mental health issues, they're kind of the trifecta of narcissistic and psychological abuse. I didn't know at the time that this toxic environment is what was causing that high cortisol and being in a constant state of fight or flight, because you never know what version of him you're going to get. Hearing him come through the door when he gets home from work, you're automatically walking on eggshells and living a life where you're constantly on edge. It creates that level of stress. It makes you sick. You will get sick from this. I now know that, this was disrupting my nervous system regulation, and the high cortisol and that toxicity is directly tied to why I was diagnosed with multiple autoimmune conditions, including narcolepsy, which came into play a little bit later. I'm having trouble working. And this is when I lost my first job. And I remember specifically, I worked from home, and it wasn't even a hard job. It was a job that I loved very, very much. I was now an analyst, a data analyst, and I loved it. And my bosses, they were very fair, but they were very clear that you're not showing up the way that you used to, and I wasn't able to show up the way that was needed. And when you're in this toxic environment and you're trying to navigate this level of abuse and this level of addiction, and you're basically putting your head in the sand of not wanting to acknowledge what this addiction is doing to your family, it makes you incredibly sick, and it makes it very hard for you to work. The mental health comes into play, and the chronic fatigue, the chronic pain. It's really, really difficult to be able to give to a boss what they need. And not to mention, as we're progressing into his addiction, he's becoming more and more dependent on me. He is constantly, constantly needing my attention. The more that I am spending time at a job, or the more that I'm spending time, trying to, create an income for myself, the more he's trying to draw me back into keeping him as the focus. And this is where his narcissism is really starting to come through. And in these years of, 2016 through, 2020, that narcissism is becoming increasingly worse and worse and harder to navigate. And I'm getting these signs, but I am frozen. My nervous system is dysregulated, and I don't know how to navigate it. And I don't know how to talk about it. I don't know how to come clean and be honest, because I come from that generation where you don't air your dirty laundry, right? You don't talk about the bad stuff. You put on a good face and make sure that it looks presentable, and you perform. And you'll kill yourself doing this if you don't acknowledge and you don't really come to terms with the reality of what this addiction does and how it plays into sort of that cycle. One of the things that I noticed during this time is that he was very open to getting sober. We talked about it all the time. Like I said, we were in Celebrate Recovery, we were in therapy, and he was actively trying to wean himself off of the alcohol. He was starting to notice that if he did not drink, he was now drinking from sunup to sundown. And if he did not have a drink by 10 a.m., he's getting the shakes, and he's now having these withdrawal symptoms that are incredibly debilitating. And the withdrawal symptoms are now coming through as, a sickness. He'll get sick if he doesn't drink. And so he's now drinking just to stay regulated. And this is where that trap happens. I now know, because of what we've gone through, that alcohol addiction is, at least as far as I'm concerned, or as far as I've been told by other doctors, alcohol addiction is one of the only addictions where the withdrawals are just as deadly as the disease. And so we're now at the point where he's so chemically addicted that he's damned if he does, damned if he doesn't. If he stops drinking, he's risking seizures, he's risking heart attack, he's risking stroke. If he continues drinking, he's risking all of those things as well. And so we're now entering that territory to where he's drinking just to stay regulated. And I'm starting to understand that, if he does quit, he's going to need to be in a medical program. He's going to need to spend months in a hospital in order to get through this. And he was unwilling to do that because of what it would do to his job. He was very much driven by providing for his family and providing for his kids, and his job was his life. And he was not willing to make the sacrifice of potentially losing a job in order to get the health care that he desperately needed. And that pride right there is really what led to his downfall. And navigating this during the time we're going through these situations to where he would get to a place where he could wean himself off and then quit, but he had to wean himself there. And if he did quit, I don't even know, he would tell me that he quit. I now don't know that he actually did quit. He seemed to be sober, but if you know an addict, you know that when their mouth is moving, they're probably lying. Now the lies are just flowing out of him like it's his job. And so he's just lying to cover that addiction, thinking that I can't tell the difference. And I know he's lying. And, it's this horrible cycle that we keep finding ourselves into. The grief that he had experienced that really started him down this chemical addiction is also coming into play. For him, it was once every 2 to 3 years, he was losing people. And by, 2017, 2018, he had already lost 3 to 4 very important people who were very close in his village. And that grief is one of the things that kept him at the bar. And he's now, using that as an excuse, right? He can talk to a stranger at the bar if he's drunk. He can't talk to a therapist. And those are the choices that he made, which I know were bullshit. He should have, we had the means and we had the money. He had everything at his disposal. All he had to do was get sober, and he made those choices. And the more that he continued down that path, the more, the saxophones are getting louder, the writing's on the wall. I'm now not working, which put me in an incredibly vulnerable place because I have severe medical issues. I'm dependent on his insurance. I'm not working, and we have 2 small children that I'm responsible for taking care of. He's never around. We never see him. I'm basically a single mom. And all of that on my shoulders it was too much for me to bear. And my medical health just continued to tank. And, we kept thinking that getting a new house or moving to a new location would fix us, and it didn't. And in this situation, we're out in the country. He's got 2 acres. He loves working in the yard. He loves doing those things. Those things weren't helping. And he refused to get the help that he needed and the help that he deserved. And I refused to really make the moves that I needed to make in order to protect myself and my children. And the more that we are continuing down this path, the more it's becoming very evident, not just with the people around me, because I'm being isolated from my village. I'm being he's now, that narcissism is really coming through, and that abuse is really coming through more and more. And he is now manipulating me to really be isolated from my support system. And so the more that I'm isolated from my support system and the more that I'm alienated from my support system, the more he has me in lock. And I am now put in a position to where even if I wanted to leave, it's going to be incredibly difficult because he's a high functioning alcoholic. And he's now, that narcissism and that abuse is really at the forefront. And so, in order to protect his ego and hide that abuse, he's now doubling down on he's the breadwinner, he handles the insurance, he handles all of the finances. There's coercive control, financial abuse, medical abuse, narcissistic abuse, psychological abuse, and now physical abuse. We're having situations to where, he's enraged and out of his mind, drunk, his eyes are black, and I'm getting body checked into walls here and there. With 2 young children and all of these pressures, my nervous system is tanked. And the thought of me leaving seems impossible. And I'm being told, you can't leave me. You're never going to leave me. If you leave me, I'm taking those kids. If you try to leave me and talk about this abuse, you'll never see those kids again. And I'm now under that full manipulative control of, that psychological abuse of you can't leave me. There's no way that you can leave me. If you leave me, I'm going to make it incredibly difficult for you. You're never going to see your children. You're the one with mental health problems. You're the one who's having the medical issues. You can't even keep a job. And there's no way that you can survive without me. And, I started to believe this. And so I'm realizing that I'm stuck. I'm realizing that if I do ever want to get out of the situation, he's already made it clear that I left him once. He's not going to allow me to leave him ever again. And I'm now coming to that understanding that if I do leave, it is going to be an incredibly difficult process. And so I'm going to stop here. And I'm going to continue in our next episode. And if you've stayed this long, I really appreciate your support. If you want to support me as a creator, please subscribe and like and comment. I'd love to hear your story and, share this with someone who might be struggling. That struggle that we go through behind closed doors, we keep it hidden, and we keep it hidden behind a perfectly curated Instagram and trying to perform and keep our composure. But the reality is that, we need help, and we need a village, and we need a support system. And, this type of addiction and now narcissistic and psychological abuse, it's designed to alienate us from not just our family, but our friends. And, if you're currently struggling with your mental health and this level of abuse or even addiction, I would just please reach out for medical help. I'm going to try and have some resources in my description to help guide that situation. But, I'm not a doctor or a therapist or a coach. I'm a survivor. And my story is just being told so in the hopes that it can be a guide for someone else. And so, if you're currently struggling or someone who's struggling, please do what you can to get that help that can put you in a place to where you can eventually leave and protect yourself. And again, thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.